The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 did not destroy a city. It erased one. On the night of October 8th, flames consumed over 3 square miles of urban landscape in less than 30 hours, reducing 17,000 structures to ash and leaving 100,000 people homeless. The official narrative speaks of a cow, a lantern, and catastrophic urban negligence. But the physical evidence tells a different story entirely. When you examine the architectural remains, the building materials, the infrastructure that supposedly burned, and the speed with which an entirely new metropolis rose from those ashes, you begin to see not a tragedy of accident, but something far more deliberate. Chicago before the fire was not the wooden frontier town described in textbooks. It was a city of stone monuments, iron frameworks, and architectural sophistication that rivaled any European capital. What burned that night and what replaced it suggests not disaster, but transformation by design. Walk through the photographic archives of pre-fire Chicago, and you encounter a problem that historians consistently dismiss. The city photographed in the 1860s shows multi-story masonry buildings, ornate stone facades, sophisticated metalwork, and infrastructure that contradicts the narrative of flammable construction. The Crosby Opera House, completed in 1865, featured Italian marble interiors, gas lighting systems, and iron structural supports. The Chamber of Commerce building stood 6 stories tall with granite columns and elaborate stone carvings. The Palmer House Hotel, finished just 13 days before the fire, incorporated fireproof construction techniques, including iron beams and brick vaulting. These were not wooden structures vulnerable to a single ignition point. They were engineered buildings designed to resist exactly the kind of conflagration that supposedly destroyed them. Yet the fire consumed them all. So with such totality that investigators found only foundation stones and twisted metal frames. How does stone burn? How does iron melt in a fire fueled by wooden structures and household materials? The temperatures required to compromise structural masonry and liquefy iron exceed anything achievable in an urban fire spreading through conventional combustibles. The official timeline compounds this impossibility. The fire allegedly began around 9 p.m. on Sunday night in or near the O'Leary barn on DeKoven Street. By Monday evening, it had crossed the main branch of the Chicago River, leaped the South Branch, and consumed the entire commercial district, the North Side and sections of the West Side. Wind is blamed for the spread. Yet the fire moved against prevailing wind patterns at several points, jumped fire breaks that should have contained it, and ignored natural barriers that routinely stopped previous urban fires. Witness accounts describe flames that moved with unnatural speed and intensity, fire that seemed to seek out specific buildings while leaving others untouched, and explosions that preceded the arrival of flames rather than resulting from them. Fire Marshal Robert A. Williams reported structures exploding before fire reached them, as though charges had been set in advance. This detail appears in his official report, but is universally ignored in subsequent histories. Why would buildings explode ahead of an approaching fire unless something other than approaching flames caused the explosions? Consider the geography of what burned and what survived. The fire destroyed the commercial core, the government district, the financial centers, and the most architecturally significant neighborhoods. It consumed libraries, archives, court records, property deeds, and municipal documents. The Chicago Historical Society building burned, taking with it irreplaceable collections of early city documents, photographs, and artifacts. Yet certain structures survived intact within the burn zone itself. The water tower and pumping station, both built of limestone, stood essentially undamaged despite being surrounded by total destruction. Critics claim this proves nothing more than superior construction. But both buildings show scorch marks and heat damage consistent with exposure to intense flame. They should have failed structurally if temperatures were high enough to melt iron girders blocks away. Their survival suggests selective destruction rather than indiscriminate conflagration. Other survivors include specific warehouses, certain banks, and particular industrial facilities, many of which were subsequently purchased by the same investment groups that financed reconstruction. The speed of reconstruction presents perhaps the most compelling evidence of pre-planning. Within days of the fire's end, architects and developers presented complete building plans for entire city blocks. Within weeks, construction materials arrived in quantities that would have required months to manufacture and transport. Within 2 years, Chicago had rebuilt not just what was lost, but had constructed an entirely new city twice the size of the old one, featuring architectural innovations and urban planning principles that supposedly had not yet been developed. The Chicago School of Architecture emerged fully formed from the ashes, introducing steel frame construction, fireproof design, and vertical building techniques that transformed urban architecture worldwide. These innovations did not evolve gradually through experimentation and iteration. They appeared immediately, as though the fire had simply cleared space for a pre-existing blueprint. Daniel Burnham and John Root established their architectural partnership in 1873, just 2 years after the fire, and immediately began producing buildings that incorporated structural systems decades ahead of their time. The Montauk Building, completed in 1882, used a steel skeleton frame that should not have been technically feasible given the limitations of contemporary metallurgy and engineering knowledge. Where did these techniques originate? Who trained these architects in methods that had no precedent in American or European construction? The official answer points to innovation born of necessity. But the designs themselves reference architectural principles and aesthetic sensibilities that align more closely with much older European and classical traditions than with frontier pragmatism. The post-fire buildings of Chicago display proportions, decorative schemes, and structural logics that suggest inheritance rather than invention, as though builders were restoring something previously known rather than pioneering something new. Financial records reveal another layer of orchestrated transformation. In the months before the fire, property transactions in the affected areas increased dramatically. Certain investors sold holdings at elevated prices, while others, knowing buyers, acquired strategic parcels at values that only make sense if they anticipated complete redevelopment. Insurance claims after the fire totaled nearly $200 million in contemporary currency. But many major property owners had increased their coverage in the weeks immediately before October 8th. Some policies were written with unusual clauses that specifically covered total destruction and provided accelerated payouts. Several insurance companies collapsed under the weight of claims, but others, primarily those connected to Eastern banking interests and European financial houses, paid quickly and then participated directly in reconstruction as major investors. The same names appear on insurance payouts, construction contracts, and property deeds for rebuilt districts. This is not opportunism following disaster. This is coordinated financial engineering that required advanced knowledge. The investment patterns become even more suspicious when you trace the corporate structures involved. Multiple reconstruction firms were established in the weeks immediately following the fire, capitalized with funds that appeared to have been prepared in advance. These companies held no significant assets before October 8th. Yet within days of the fire's end, they possessed the financial resources to purchase entire city blocks and begin immediate construction. The money did not come from Chicago banks, most of which had been destroyed or severely damaged. It came from Eastern financial institutions and European investment houses that had no obvious prior involvement in Chicago real estate. Letters between investors, preserved in private collections, reveal discussions about Chicago properties and reconstruction opportunities that were written before the fire occurred. These are not predictions or speculations about general urban development. They are specific references to parcels, building types, and construction timelines that only make sense if the writers knew destruction was coming. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. The cow becomes an important symbol in this context, not as the actual cause, but as the perfect scapegoat. Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant woman operating a small dairy in a working-class neighborhood, provided the ideal narrative focus for both media and official investigations. She was foreign, poor, and female, embodying all the prejudices of the era's elite classes. The story of her cow kicking over a lantern required no complex explanation, no uncomfortable questions about urban planning or financial manipulation, no investigation into why fire departments responded slowly or why water pressure failed at critical moments. It placed blame on the immigrant underclass rather than on municipal authorities or wealthy developers. Mrs. O'Leary denied the story until her death, and multiple witnesses later recanted their testimony, admitting they had been pressured to support the cow narrative by investigators who had already decided on their conclusion. The Chicago Republican published a confession in 1893 from one reporter who admitted fabricating key details of the story. Yet the cow remained the official explanation because the alternative required asking who actually benefited from the fire. Examine the urban planning that emerged from Reconstruction, and you find another impossibility. The new Chicago implemented a comprehensive grid system, zoning regulations, building codes, and infrastructure improvements that required years of planning, surveying, and legal framework development. These systems appeared within months of the fire's end, fully formed and ready for implementation. The Chicago Relief and Aid Society, formed immediately after the fire, operated with funding that exceeded what could have been raised through charitable donations, distributed aid according to predetermined criteria that favored certain neighborhoods over others, and coordinated reconstruction according to plans that had no apparent author but everyone seemed to know. The Society's records, stored in fireproof vaults, detailed expenditures and decisions, but revealed little about where the actual planning originated or who set priorities for rebuilding. It functioned as an invisible government, making decisions about the city's future without democratic input or public oversight. The architectural aesthetics of the rebuilt city reference styles and influences that should have been geographically and temporally distant from 1870s Chicago. Buildings incorporated Egyptian revival elements, Romanesque details, Gothic ornamentation, and classical proportions that suggest either access to extensive architectural libraries or first-hand knowledge of ancient construction techniques. The Auditorium building, completed in 1889 by Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan, features acoustic design so sophisticated that modern engineers still cannot fully explain how its creators achieved such precise sound distribution without computer modeling or advanced physics. The interior mosaics, structural innovations, and decorative programs reference traditions that supposedly existed only in fragmented form in academic collections. Yet here, they appear fully integrated into functional modern buildings, suggesting continuity with older knowledge rather than archaeological revival. The fire itself displayed characteristics that witnesses struggled to explain within conventional frameworks. Multiple accounts describe flames that burned blue or green rather than orange and yellow, suggesting chemical accelerants or unusual fuel sources. Temperatures in certain areas reportedly melted glass and metal, while leaving paper and wood partially intact. An impossibility if the fire burned uniformly from conventional sources. The Chicago Tribune building, constructed with fireproof materials and housing the city's most important newspaper, burned so completely that investigators found its iron safe fused shut with documents inside, reduced to compressed carbon. Yet paper records in wooden structures blocks away survived with minor damage. This selective destruction pattern recurs throughout the burn zone, suggesting directed energy or deliberately placed incendiaries, rather than a spreading conflagration. Weather conditions on October 8th create additional questions. The city had experienced severe drought for months, creating dry conditions that encouraged fire spread. But meteorological records show this drought affected a massive geographic area spanning multiple states, all of which experienced significant fires on the same night as Chicago's conflagration. The Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin killed more people than the Chicago fire, destroying an entire town and surrounding forest lands. Michigan suffered devastating fires across multiple communities. All these fires began on October 8, 1871, within hours of each other, across hundreds of miles. Official explanations cite coincidental weather conditions, but the simultaneous timing suggests either coordinated arson on an unprecedented scale or a natural phenomenon so unusual that it has no historical parallel. Some witnesses reported seeing fireballs falling from the sky, leading to speculation about meteor showers or atmospheric phenomena. But no astronomical record supports such an event. The coordinated timing more logically suggests human agency with continental reach. Underground Chicago provides the final piece of this puzzle. The current city sits atop multiple layers of previous construction, with basements, tunnels, and foundations extending far deeper than the official 1871 street level. When construction crews excavate for modern developments, they regularly discover architectural remains that predate the fire by supposed decades. Yet these structures show building techniques and material quality inconsistent with frontier settlement architecture. Stone foundations display masonry work comparable to ancient Roman construction, with precision joints and materials that should not have been available to early Chicago builders. Tunnel systems connect buildings across distances that suggest coordinated planning by a central authority that official histories claim did not exist. These underground spaces were not simply basements, but functional areas with finished walls, paved floors, and architectural details indicating they were primary spaces rather than utility areas. The pre-fire water and sewage systems present similar paradoxes. Engineering surveys conducted before supposed upgrades reveal infrastructure of such sophistication that it challenges narratives of Chicago as a young frontier city. Brick sewers with arched ceilings and precisely graded slopes. Water mains made from fitted stone rather than wood or early iron. And pump systems that required engineering knowledge supposedly not yet developed in America. These systems were not primitive installations upgraded after the fire. They were complex networks that functioned effectively until they were destroyed and replaced with new infrastructure that was technologically different but not necessarily superior. The replacement suggests not improvement, but transition, as though one civilization's technology was being supplanted by another's. The demographics of who left Chicago after the fire and who arrived during Reconstruction reveal another pattern of coordinated transformation. Working-class neighborhoods that burned were not rebuilt as residential areas, but converted to commercial and industrial zones. The residents displaced by fire were not given priority in Reconstruction housing, but instead found themselves priced out of the new city. Meanwhile, waves of skilled craftsmen, architects, engineers, and construction specialists arrived from eastern cities in Europe, bringing with them expertise in building techniques that supposedly did not yet exist. Where were these workers trained? Who coordinated their arrival? Employment records show construction firms hiring complete crews who appeared to have worked together previously. Yet no record exists of their prior projects. They functioned as though they had been preparing for Chicago's reconstruction before the fire occurred. The legal framework established after the fire created mechanisms for property seizure and redevelopment that benefited specific interests while dispossessing original owners. New building codes made reconstruction prohibitively expensive for small property holders, forcing them to sell to larger developers who had the capital to meet the new requirements. Zoning laws changed land use designations, converting residential properties to commercial zones and making it illegal to rebuild what had existed before. These regulations did not evolve through democratic process or public debate. They were implemented by emergency decree through the Relief and Aid Society and municipal authorities operating under crisis powers. The result was wholesale transfer of property from a diverse ownership base to a concentrated group of investors who profited enormously from reconstruction. The timeline of technological adoption in post-fire Chicago outpaces what should have been possible through normal innovation cycles. Electric lighting appeared in commercial buildings years before Edison systems were commercially available. Elevator technology that supposedly was not perfected until the 1880s was installed in buildings completed in the late 1870s. Steel production techniques that required processes not yet industrialized in America were employed in structural frameworks. These are not minor chronological discrepancies. They represent systematic deployment of technologies that official timelines claim did not yet exist. Either the standard history of technological development is fundamentally wrong, or Chicago's reconstruction utilized knowledge and capabilities that were deliberately concealed from public record. The cultural transformation of Chicago after the fire matches the physical reconstruction in scope and speed. Within a decade, the city had established world-class cultural institutions, universities, libraries, and museums that rivaled those in cities with centuries of accumulated wealth and tradition. The Art Institute of Chicago, founded in 1879, immediately possessed collections that would have required generations to assemble through normal acquisition. The Newberry Library, established in 1887, opened with rare book collections and manuscripts that should not have been available on the American market. These institutions did not build their collections gradually. They appeared with their holdings essentially complete, as though entire libraries had been transferred to Chicago from elsewhere. The same pattern appears in musical institutions, theatrical companies, and educational establishments. Chicago became a cultural capital not through organic development, but through wholesale importation of established institutions. The fire's impact on historical documentation creates a convenient void in Chicago's official past. With archives destroyed and records lost, the pre-fire city exists primarily through selective photographic evidence and sanitized official narratives. Alternative versions of Chicago's early history, documents that might have revealed different origins or purposes for the settlement, conveniently disappeared in the flames. What remains is a curated version of the past that supports the narrative of frontier town transformed into modern metropolis through industrial determination. But the physical evidence embedded in foundations, the architectural sophistication visible in pre-fire photographs, and the impossible speed of reconstruction all suggest a different story. Chicago was not transformed by the fire. It was reset. The Chicago fire was not an accident. It was not a tragedy of urban neglect or frontier carelessness. It was a calculated transformation of a city that contained evidence of something previous, something architecturally sophisticated and technologically advanced, something that could not be allowed to remain visible in the emerging industrial age. The official narrative of a cow and a lantern serves the same purpose as all historical simplifications, reducing complex events to digestible stories that prevent deeper investigation. But the physical evidence remains in foundations still buried, in the impossible speed of reconstruction, in the architectural knowledge that appeared fully formed and in the financial mechanisms that turned catastrophe into windfall for specific investors. Chicago before October 8, 1871, was a city built on the remains of something older, a settlement that had inherited infrastructure it did not create and had maintained buildings it perhaps did not fully understand. The fire did not destroy a city of wooden shanties and frontier optimism. It erased a stone metropolis with advanced engineering, then replaced it with a new city designed according to different principles and built by different interests. The flames that night did not spread randomly from a barn. They moved with purpose, targeting specific structures, crossing barriers they should not have crossed, and leaving destruction patterns that defy natural fire behavior. When you understand that Chicago was not rebuilt but replaced, you begin to see the same pattern in other cities that experienced similar catastrophic fires in the same era. Boston burned in 1872. Baltimore suffered massive fires. San Francisco would burn spectacularly in 1906. Each conflagration followed by impossibly rapid reconstruction. Each transformation erasing architectural evidence of previous sophistication. Each fire-clearing space for a new urban order controlled by the same financial networks. The destruction was not accidental. It was systematic. And what rose from those ashes was not recovery, but occupation. The official history of the Great Chicago Fire asks you to believe in coincidence, to accept that a single ignition point destroyed 3 square miles of urban infrastructure in 30 hours, and to ignore the architectural, financial, and engineering evidence that contradicts every element of that narrative. But the stones remember. The foundations remember. And the city that exists today stands as permanent evidence that what was lost was far more significant than what you have been told was destroyed. The fire of 1871 did not mark Chicago's rebirth. It marked its conquest.